I think I see Amy on the phone. I think she should say a prayer.
Of the Loader variety?
Is there any other?
Amy Loader from Delaware, ladies and gentlemen, which I'm sure...
I can. To be completely transparent, I'm scanning something for work while also listening.
Okay.
Could I take it next time?
That's fine. So Amy Loader, ladies and gentlemen, is too busy to pray. You heard it here first.
I'm unprepared.
I'll pray.
Super. Thank you so much. Obviously,
Okay.
Amy's a very good friend. It's just a joke. I'm not actually naming and shaming Amy in any way, shape, or form, as I have done in the past. So yes, welcome. We've got a good amount of people in now. So whoever's offered to pray, was that you, dear Sandra, who's offered to pray?
It was, yes. I shall pray now. Okay, I'm going to go find a nice prayer for us to start us off.
Superb. Again, it's very important we have a nice prayer. None of these bad prayers. We want only the best will do. Only the finest prayer will do. I'm glad you're alive. I was worried you almost burnt your dinner last time you were there. Such in love with the fire of God's word.
Now you've set the bar very high. I'm worried now. Am I going to choose the right one?
I'm sure it'll be fine. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've got an intense session today. It's going to be difficult to navigate this one. I'll be honest. There's some concepts and themes that are maybe a little bit tricky here, but hopefully we'll take them by the horns and we'll manage to get through and work through some of these. So once Sandra's ready, we will kick off with our prayer and then go into it.
Glorified art thou, O Lord my God. I implore thee by the onrushing winds of thy grace, and by them who are the day springs of thy purpose and the dawning places of thine inspiration, help them then to partake of its fruits, to incline their ears to the rustling of its leaves, and to the sweetness of the voice of the bird that chanteth upon its branches. Thou art verily the help in peril, the inaccessible, the almighty, the most bountiful. Baha'u'llah.
Dear Sandra, all the way from the United Kingdom, representing, ladies and gentlemen, it is God Passes By. The next session has come in. We've got loads of beautiful souls with us. So what I'm going to do is, per usual, I'm going to give you a quick recap of the events that had taken place in the previous session. In the previous session, we had dealt with the 7 martyrs of Tehran. Of course, we've had the 3 battles that we've spoken about, and we know that they were in Fort Sheikh Tabasi, in none other than Neyriz, and also in Zanjan. These were the 3 places. The next place was in Tehran, where we deal with the 7 martyrs of Tehran. This took place 4 months before the martyrdom of the Bab, and it was organized by the Prime Minister at the time, and also Mahmoud Khan, the mayor, and Hussein, this ulama from Tehran. And they basically were trying to persecute these 7 martyrs. One of them, of course, who was His Holiness the Bab's uncle, Haji Mirza Sayyid Ali. And they had the option to perform something called Taghiyeh, which is in Islam where you can deny your faith in times of peril. However, the Bab had ruled that this was not acceptable. None of them used this Taghiyeh thing that doesn't exist in the Babi faith, but had in their previous faith. So this was an option. Then we also know that people had come to the fore. Some people had tried to save Haji Mirza Sayyid Ali, who was a merchant of note, obviously. So very powerful merchants came in to try and speak to him. Even the Prime Minister himself tried speaking to a couple of people to say, look, just stop believing in this what he called nonsense. But they were so firm and so steadfast that they end up getting martyred. All 7 of them, and it's a very, very beautiful account that's in the Dawnbreakers. We then know that the bodies were taken and they were left for 3 days outside, where they were spat, they were kicked, all sorts of things happened to these bodies. There's a eulogy from Baha'u'llah about these 7 martyrs of Tehran. We then looked at something from the Bihar, this book of traditions from Islam, which talks about these 7 goats, and these 7 goats are the ones that would go before their Lord, and these were the 7 martyrs. So we believe this to be prophesied that this will take place. We then know when the Bab had heard about this and all the atrocities that had taken place, the Bab for 6 months was unable to dictate or write. For 5 months he was in solitary confinement. For 9 days he neither ate nor drank. Such were the tears that rained continually down from his face. He then talks about Godus, who he refers to as the last name of God. as the last point as well. The Bab mentions in the Kulut Ta'am, the tablets of all food, he's mentioned as the Nochte Ochar. We then know that there's some Quranic verses that are talked about these. There are these things that are talked about this impostor, this messenger charged with imposture. And this is in Surah 36, Yasin of the Holy Quran, where it talks about these two apostolic figures that are going to be regenerated. And essentially these, according to Baha'u'llah, it's claimed that they are firstly the Bab, and then the second one is Quddus. Such praise that's being lavished upon. Then we know it talks about the revelation of St. John, and it talks about one of these two witnesses. And in the revelation of St. John, it talks about these two witnesses who would proclaim and then would be martyred. And it's explained that these are the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the second one was the Imam Ali. This is before the regeneration. However, when they're regenerated, they're going to be His Holiness the Bab, and the second one is Quddus. So again, the station of Quddus, highly exalted. And then we know in chapters 11 and 12 is where it really deals with this in the Revelation of St. John. It then goes on to talk about the three woes that will take place, which is a separate thing. And the three woes, the first one was the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The second one was His Holiness the Bab. And the third woe, it says, after these two woes will come very quickly, refers to Baha'u'llah. So there's a bit of prophecy that's thrown in there. We then learn a little bit about Mullah Hussein, who the Bab calls the beloved of my heart, the primal mirror. And then we hear some praises from Sayyid Kazem as well, who had so lavishly praised Mullah Hussein after he'd gone on his mission to Esfahan and Mashhad. From there, he sends a letter back to Sayyid Kazem, where he was charged with this task of winning the support of two very prominent ulamas. And the way Sayyid Kazem praised him, some people think that maybe he's actually the promised one. We talk about Vahid, who's described as this unique and peerless figure of his age. He's also mentioned in the Dalail al-Sabeh. Then we move a little bit and we talk about Tahereh, how Tahereh still has troubles. We find out at this period that half the letters of the living have passed away. They, of course, died in the Battle of Fort Sheikh Tabarsi. The Bab then goes on to forecast his own death, we find out, in the Panshan, where he says in 6 years from the start of his revelation, the Kitab of Panshan, he says that he will be martyred. He also talks about this in the Qayyum al-Azma, which is a commentary on the Surah of Yusuf, the Surah of Joseph. 40 days before his martyrdom, His Holiness the Bab had taken his pens, his pen case, his seals, his rings, and had given them to someone by the name of Mullah Bagher. Mullah Bagher was then charged to give them to the amanuensis Mirza Ahmad, and he's one of the amanuensis who's responsible for us having most of the writings of the Bab that we have today. He was one person that was allowed to practice this thing called Taghyir. Once this all takes place, Mirza Taqi Khan, the new prime minister, comes in and he wants to bring about change. He says, look at all the afflictions that have been taking place, and the conflicts of Zanjan is actually still raging at this point. And he says, look, we haven't done anything to squash the zeal of the Babis. In fact, they're more animated than ever before. So he decides that, right, what we need to do is we need to make sure the Bab is put to death. We need to crush this out. So the Bab, whilst in the prison of Chehreg around here, is going to be summoned to Tabriz. Now, Mirza Taqi Khan asked Prince Hamza Mirza to deliver the Bab, who's the governor of Azerbaijan. He says, please, will you deliver the Bab to Tabriz so we can kill the Bab, essentially. He flatly refuses to do this. Then Mirza Taqi Khan gets his own brother, Mirza Hassan Khan, to carry out this atrocious task. This takes place, and then we know what pursues after this. After this, we know that His Holiness the Bab is in his prison. We have the whole martyrdom, which I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with the martyrdom, so I'll gloss over that. That His Holiness the Bab is talking to his amanuensis in prison. They come to get him and they say, we're going to kill you now. The Bab says, I'm not ready. The Bab is taken as drags with someone by the name of Anis. 750 bullets rain down upon the Bab. Anis is there by himself. The muskets, smoked, clears, and the Bab has disappeared. Where is the Bab? He is with his amanuensis back in his prison. Now, what's interesting, there are traditions from this Bihar that talk about how he'll be killed by one of their own, essentially, how the Muslims arguably would be the ones that would kill him, which is why they get Samkhana Armani, this Armenian guy, this Christian guy, Sam Khan, to be the first regiment to shoot the Bab. He says to the Bab, I do not want to do this, and the Bab says, if you're being truthful and honest, God will relieve you of the duty. So he, after this first shooting, he was in charge of the first regiment, he is basically turns around and says, I'm no longer involved in this, I'm completely off the hook. Someone who comes in is someone by the name of Aga Jana Khamseh, who basically, his regiment, it's a Muslim regiment, who comes in and he basically takes care of the shooting. And I want to say Muslim regiment, not that this is the way Muslims behave at all, as in the beautiful Muslims and the holy scriptures of Islam is so uplifting and beautiful. But obviously, like any faith, over time, corruption creeps in and people lose sometimes the beauty of this. So, Aga Jana Khamseh, the one who was responsible for this, we hear that there's this huge earthquake. And actually, when the Martyrdom of the Bab takes place, there's this massive gale that takes place, and there's this earthquake that's predicted in the Revelation of St. John that's going to take place. But the soldiers who were involved in Aga Jana Khamseh, the ones who martyred the Bab, we know that 250 of them die when this wall collapses upon them. So this is another earthquake. The other 500 are actually put to death by firing squad for committing mutiny. We then know that the body is taken and it's put outside the moat. Two brave souls, Haji Solomon Khan and Haji Ali Yar, are the ones who go and rescue the body of the Bab. The body of the Bab, which is then passed around from post to pillar, and over a period of roughly 50 years, is then eventually laid to rest on Mount Carmel. Again, the story of this is very beautiful, and there's a book called Journey to a Mountain, which is fascinating about how the body of the Bab actually ends up in that area on Mount Carmel. We then hear about the news having spread from the east to the west that the Tsar of Russia was intrigued as to what was going on. Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy, the philosopher, was also involved in what was going on and wanted to know more, and then we know his involvement with the faith then increases. We then understand that the Bab is standing at the pivotal point of these two universal cycles, the Adamic cycle and the new cycle which is being ushered in. So it's very beautiful, the position that the Bab is taken. We then go on to learn about some of the similarities. There are copious similarities with that of His Holiness Christ. So there's a whole bunch of things, including the name of the Bab. The way the Bab is written, it's written with obviously two B's and an A, and loosely speaking, a Bab, the letter B is almost a horizontal line. The A, the Aleph, is a vertical line, and the next B is again a horizontal line. So this almost creates this cross, if you see, which also kind of represents what's going on and the correlations of His Holiness Christ. This is the theory that's put forward, but the similarities are many and manifold. That concludes what we had previously learned. We are ready to go on to learn some more as to what's happened. Are there any comments or questions before I do so?
Can you give a quick outline of what the Adamic age is? Is it related to Adam?
Beautiful question, Sandra. Yeah, the Adamic cycle, it's believed that starts with Adam. So with the first prophet, basically, it starts with Adam, and since then, many, many prophets, lots that have been lost to our history, basically come, and then the fulfillment of that is obviously when the Bab comes and he stands, and the Howler started this new revelation.
It should be remembered, however, that apart from the miracle associated with the Bab's execution, he, unlike the founder of the Christian religion, is not only to be regarded as the independent author of a divinely revealed dispensation, but must also be recognized as the herald of a new era and the inaugurator of a great universal prophetic cycle. Nor should the important fact be overlooked that, whereas the chief adversaries of Jesus Christ in his lifetime were the Jewish rabbis and their associates, the forces arrayed against the Bab represented the combined civil and ecclesiastical powers of Persia, which, from the moment of his declaration to the hour of his death, persisted unitedly and by every means at their disposal in conspiring against the upholders and in vilifying the tenets of his revelation. The Bab, acclaimed by Baha'u'llah as the essence of essences, the sea of seas, the point round whom the realities of the prophets and messengers revolve, from whom God hath caused to proceed the knowledge of all that was and shall be, whose rank excelleth that of all the prophets, and whose revelation transcendeth the comprehension and understanding of all their chosen ones, had delivered his message and discharged his mission. He who was, in the words of Abdu'l-Baha, the morn of truth and harbinger of the most great light, whose advent at once signalized the termination of the prophetic cycle and the inception of the cycle of fulfillment, had simultaneously, through his revelation, banished the shades of night that had descended upon his country and proclaimed the impending rise of that incomparable orb whose radiance was to envelop the whole of mankind. He, as affirmed by himself, the primal point from which have been generated all created things, one of the sustaining pillars of the primal word of God, the mystic fane, the great announcement, the flame of that supernal light that glowed upon Sinai, the remembrance of God, concerning whom a separate covenant hath been established with each and every prophet, had, through his advent, at once fulfilled the promise of all ages and ushered in the consummation of all revelations. He, the Qayyam, he who ariseth, promised to the Shias, the Mehdi, one who is guided, awaited by the Sunnis, the return of John the Baptist, expected by the Christians, the Ushidar Ma, referred to in the Zoroastrian scriptures, the return of Elijah, anticipated by the Jews, whose revelation was to show forth the signs and tokens of all the prophets, who was to manifest the perfection of Moses, the radiance of Jesus, and the patience of Job, had appeared, proclaimed his cause, been mercilessly persecuted, and died gloriously. The second woe spoken of in the Apocalypse of St. John the Divine had at long last appeared, and the first of the two messengers, whose appearance had been prophesied in the Quran, had been sent down. The first trumpet blast, destined to smite the earth with extermination, announced in the latter book, had finally been sounded. The inevitable, the catastrophe, the resurrection, the earthquake of the last hour, foretold by that same book, had all come to pass. The clear tokens had been sent down, and the Spirit had breathed, and the souls had waked up, and the heaven had been cleft, and the angels had ranged in order, and the stars had been blotted out, and the earth had cast forth her burden, and paradise had been brought near, and hell had been made to blaze, and the book had been set, and the bridge had been laid out, and the balance had been set up, and the mountains scattered in dust. The cleansing of the sanctuary, prophesied by Daniel and confirmed by Jesus Christ in his reference, the abomination of desolation, had been accomplished. The day whose length shall be 1,000 years, foretold by the apostle of God in his book, had terminated. The 42 months during which the holy city, as predicted by St. John the Divine, would be trodden underfoot had elapsed. The time of the end had been ushered in, and the first of the two witnesses, to whom, after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God would enter, had arisen and had ascended up to heaven in a cloud. The remaining 25 letters to be made manifest, according to the Islamic tradition, out of the 27 letters of which knowledge had been declared to consist, hath been revealed. The man-child, mentioned in the book of Revelation, destined to rule all nations with a rod of iron, had released, through his coming, the creative energies which, reinforced by the effusions of a swiftly succeeding and infinitely mightier revelation, were to instill into the entire human race the capacity to achieve its organic unification, attain maturity, and thereby reach the final stage in its age-long evolution. The clarion call addressed to the concourse of kings and of the sons of kings, marking the inception of a process which, accelerated by Baha'u'llah's subsequent warnings to the entire company of the monarchs of East and West, was to produce so widespread a revolution in the fortunes of royalty, had been raised in the Qayyamul Asma. The order, whose foundation the promised one was to establish in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, and the features of which the center of the covenant was to delineate in his testament, and whose administrative framework the entire body of his followers are now erecting, had been categorically announced in the Persian Bayan. The laws which were designed, on the one hand, to abolish at a stroke the privileges and ceremonials, the ordinances and institutions of a superannuated dispensation, and to bridge, on the other, the gap between an obsolete system and the institutions of a world-encompassing order, destined to supersede it, had been clearly formulated and proclaimed. The covenant which, despite the determined assaults launched against it, succeeded, unlike all previous dispensations, in preserving the integrity of the faith of its author, and in paving the way for the advent of the one who was to be its center and object, had been firmly and irrevocably established. The light which, throughout successive periods, was to propagate itself gradually from its cradle as far as Vancouver in the west and the China Sea in the east, and to diffuse its radiance as far as Iceland in the north and the Tasman Sea in the south, had broken. The forces of darkness, at first confined to the concerted hostility of the civil and ecclesiastical powers of Shia Persia, gathering momentum at a later stage through the avowed and persistent opposition of the Caliph of Islam and the Sunni hierarchy in Turkey, and destined to culminate in the fierce antagonism of the sacerdotal orders associated with other and still more powerful religious systems, had launched their initial assault. The nucleus of the divinely ordained, world-embracing community, a community whose infant strength had already plucked asunder the fetters of Shia orthodoxy, and which was, with every expansion in the range of its fellowship, to seek and obtain a wider and still more significant recognition of its claims to be the world religion of the future, had been formed and was slowly crystallizing. And lastly, the seed, endowed by the hand of omnipotence with such vast potentialities, though rudely trampled underfoot and seemingly perished from the face of the earth, had, through this very process, been vouchsafed the opportunity to germinate and remanifest itself in the shape of a still more compelling revelation, a revelation destined to blossom forth in a later period into the flourishing institutions of a worldwide administrative system, and to ripen in the golden age as yet unborn into mighty agencies functioning in consonance with the principles of a world-unifying, world-redeeming order.
Thank you very much, Anissa. So I'm pretty sure we've all got that, we've internalized it, and we're good to move on now. We've fully mastered everything it says there. So there's a lot there, ladies and gentlemen. There's quite a lot there, and we're not going to have time to really go into everything because the Guardian so beautifully goes into this and essentially says that the Bab has established himself, the faith has come, this break has taken place, that the seeds of this crystallizing faith have been sown, and things are going to go on, and the golden age is basically going to be coming in. And there are so many things he talks about, you know, the beautiful thing. The Bab talks about being the primal point, and from him are generated all things. So there's so much that are really, you know, coming out. And of course, when the Bab says this, it's through God, through the grace of God, that these things are coming out. Now, there's a couple of things there that I wanted to touch on. So there's a whole bunch of prophecies that the Guardian is glossing over, and I think in some answered questions there's circa 100 pages or so that talk about the prophecies, and definitely worth a good read and a good study to go into in your own time to really go deep into some of these things. But some of the things it talks about this 40 in 2 months. So I've just started to pick out a couple of things. Now, this 40 in 2 months is from the New Testament, and it refers essentially to after Muhammad, that there'd be 1,260 days that are going to take place before this event that's going to take place. Now, the 1,260 days, obviously in Ezekiel, I believe it's spoken that each day refers to a year. That any prophecy, when there's days spoken like this, day refers a year. And of course, 1,260 days is from the passing of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. From the time of Muhammad, peace be upon him, to 1,260 days brings us to the year 1260. And this year 1260, of course, corresponds to the year 1844. So this is one of the prophecies that has been fulfilled. Another one, it talks about the days whose lengths are 1,000 years. Now, this is mentioned twice in the Holy Quran, and it's prophesizing the end of time. And again, the day whose length is 1,000 years. We know this to be taken from the end of the minor occultation, something I've mentioned a few times, where you have the Shias, the 12, certainly they believe in the 12 Imams. So we know that you have 11 of them that come, then this 12th one goes into hiding, basically. And there are people that are speaking to these intermediaries that are speaking to this 12th one. We have these four different gates that are speaking to him, and once these cease speaking to them, so in the year 260, the Islamic year 260, this is when it's said that in 1,000 years Ghaim will then appear. So it's after this period, and this period where these four are in touch with the Ghaim, that's what we call the minor occultation. When these four disappear, there's no link to the Ghaim, that's known as the major occultation. So that again it says that in 1,000 years' time, that this the prophecy of the end of time will take place. And this is, and you take the year 260, which was the time at the last of these four was speaking as an intermediary to the Ghaim. Once you add 1,000 to the 260, you get 1260, which again refers to the year 1844. There's the mention of the abomination of desolation. Now we know this refers to basically the Temple of Jerusalem, the temple that Solomon had built. This was taken over by non-Jews. And it was, I think the Assyrians were there, and outside sources were basically in the temple. We know that I think the Ottomans, they had the Edict of Toleration, which refers to 1844. And this happens in 1844, where Jews are now allowed to come back in. So here are sort of three of the prophecies which I've sort of touched upon, and I know they're kind of difficult to grasp, especially without signs and symbols, but this is what's understood, that the abomination of desolation, which in 1844, because of the Edict of Toleration, that this had lifted the abomination of desolation. And this was in reference to the time when His Holiness Christ would return. And he's asked, you know, what's going to happen, when will you return? And Christ himself says, go and see the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel mentions this prophecy that upon the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem, there will be 2,300 days. So the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem, this started in the year 456 before Christ. So 456 before Christ this started. That's when the starting of this temple built. So if you take 2,300 days, which we know from Ezekiel, this is to be 2,300 years, and you add minus 456 to 2,300, what do we think that comes up with? Of course, that comes up with the year 1844. Another prophecy. So the whole thing of prophecies, honestly, go into some answered questions, have a look at the depth that Abdu'l-Baha goes into these priceless pearls of his. And this is the first time that anyone of note, a religious figure of note to that capacity, has really expounded upon the testaments and really given the details. So absolutely fascinating things that are there. It also mentions, again, as I mentioned in the recap, these witnesses that would be these messengers of imposture as well, and we've had the explanation that they will be regenerated. The first is the Bab, the second is Qudus. It touches again upon the revelation of St. John, these witnesses, and it talks about the woes. If you remember, it talks about the various woes that were taking place, and that again was the woes. The first one being Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the second one the Bab, and the third that will come very quickly, it talks about being Baha'u'llah. So anyway, there's a lot in there, and I understand this is a kind of confusing bit, but some answered questions is your best guide for this. Are there any comments or questions before we go on, Anisa?
Do you mind going back to the page where it was talking about what was captured in the Bayan? I think it was towards the end of the page. Not previous? Okay, this one. The order whose foundation the promised one was to establish in the Kitabi Akdas, and the features of which the center of the covenant was to delineate in his testament, and whose administrative framework the entire body of his followers are now erecting, had been categorically announced in the Persian Bayan. So I'm curious, I don't know if anybody has any insight into this, but I think I don't know if it was in this group or if it was in this other group that I'm in on weekends, but this discussion of the fact that there are things that were introduced by the Bab that were abrogated by Baha'u'llah. And then there's these things that seem like were introduced by the Bab, but were not really intended for his dispensation. Do we know why these things were introduced by the Bab in the Bayan, but they didn't really didn't really come to fruition except in the Baha'i dispensation? Why? Why did the Bab reveal them or introduce them if they weren't really intended until later?
Very good question. So a lot of these things that the Bab writes about in the Bayan are preparatory for the coming of Baha'u'llah. So when Baha'u'llah's there, they no longer stand. An example being this banning of eating onions or garlic, for example. You know, the whole point was to not offend him whom God shall make manifest, and to open people's eyes as to the fact that His Holiness Baha'u'llah is around the corner. He could be the person next to you, like really open your eyes. So I think that's a huge reason as to why. And we know with every revelation, as Baha'is understand, that there are different laws brought in for different times. So this time, when the Bab has really come in, he's really like this big slap, this thunderclap that he's bringing down, and he's like, people, wake up! And these are the certain set of laws. Also in the Bayan, a lot of these laws and things, again, but I think the Bab explains that this isn't a book of laws, and it's a eulogy to Baha'u'llah. So the whole thing, there's a lot of symbolic thing, and it says all of these things are actually only really accepted if His Holiness Baha'u'llah agrees them in the first place. So as I say, some of those things are preparatory laws, and that's why they change. And I suspect it was in this group that you learned about that, because this is the best group that exists. Are there any other comments or questions? Superb. Okay, right, we will move on. One beautiful thing, actually, which I'd really like to share with you, and perhaps I'll do this later on, is where it talks about the 25 letters. And it talks about the 27 letters of knowledge. And it's this tradition that said that 2 letters of knowledge have thus far been revealed. And if you bear with me, I'll see if I can pull this up. this quote with regards to knowledge. Actually, Anissa, if I could ask you to read this, please.
Expatiating upon the unfathomed import of the signs and tokens that have accompanied the revelation proclaimed by the Bab, the promised Gayam, he recalls these prophetic words. Knowledge is 27 letters. All that the prophets have revealed are 2 letters thereof. No man thus far hath known more than these 2 letters. But when the Gayam shall arise, he will cause the remaining 25 letters to be made manifest. Behold, adds Baha'u'llah, how great and lofty is his station. Of his revelation, he further adds, the prophets of God, his saints and chosen ones, have either not been informed or in pursuance of God's inscrutable decree, they have not disclosed.
Thank you, Anissa. So Baha'u'llah's commenting on this thing from Islam, basically that when the Ga'im comes, there will be 25 extra letters of knowledge that are brought. Now, knowledge is 27 letters, okay? So there's 27 letters of knowledge, it says right here. And then it says all that have existed previously were just 2 letters. The Bab is now bringing the other 25 letters of knowledge. Now, this is obviously metaphorical. So it's quite amazing. So there's 27 letters of knowledge, and you look at the combinations that you can get, okay? So if you have 2 letters, for example, you can take A, and then you can take another A, you can take AB, you can take BA, or you can take BB. So there's kind of 4 outcomes, okay? So now the question is, when the Bab brings 25 letters, we have 25 divided by 2, and sorry, this gets a bit mathematical, but we have 25 divided by 2, which is 12.5, giving us 12.5 more knowledge that's given to us, because previously we had 2, another 25 has come, so it's 12 and a half times more knowledge that's being given to us by the coming of the Bab, right? Wrong, absolutely wrong. And the reason why this is wrong is because you actually realize that the combination is actually 27 to the power of 27, because you can have A, and then keep going with that, and then A, and then B, and then you have all these different combinations. So it actually ends up being 27 to the power, which gives us this number of 4.434264882 E38, a very big number, almost infinite is what it's trying to tell us. So the amount of knowledge that His Holiness the Bab is bringing is just on a whole other level. That this huge jump, remember, one cycle has ended, another one has started. This is exciting stuff. Things are transforming.
So knowledge, is this knowledge of God? Is this knowledge of things?
Yeah. Divine knowledge, from what I understand, yeah.
Divine knowledge, thank you. Okay.
So what now we have brought, and I think even the Bab talks about that a babe who's born in the day of Baha'u'llah, his knowledge will be more than all the previous clergy and the rest of it. So much so is the knowledge imparted upon us. Obviously, you need to study and understand, and simply studying doesn't mean you understand. It's this whole meditating and the rest of it. So it's a lot deeper than that, but very loosely speaking, yes. So in this, it talks about these 25.
Just on that note, like when we talk about divine knowledge, that generally means knowledge of creation. So the Bab brought the remaining 25. If you look at what's happened since 1844, there's been massive increases of technology and knowledge in general, spirituality. And so I think this divine knowledge, it relates to life itself, is how we've developed as human beings. Because if you take someone from 1844, 200 years into the past, it wouldn't have been that different in terms of how they've advanced with civilization. But if you take them to our age today, it would be completely different. So it just shows you how advanced things have become since 1844, which is, I think, it's a nice little addition to this sharing of knowledge that the Bab brought.
Thank you very much, Pam. Yeah, obviously every faith has ushered in knowledge. There's no doubt as to what the wonderful Islam has brought, and the advances in science and maths and the rest of it, or Christianity. There's always this step where faith brings in knowledge, and it unveils these reverberating forces all across the world. But yes, definitely since 1844, the world that we live in now, when they talk about the end of the age, the end of the world has essentially ended. It's been more or less the same pre-1844 from the start to there. Yes, there were certain jumps, but the momentous jump, I mean, look at this now. Here I am in wonderful Reading in the United Kingdom, and we're speaking to people all across the world, just like that. The Guardian talks about, I think he predicts the internet coming in, says that knowledge will be made available to you just like that. So the jump is huge, and this is a momentous occasion that's taking place.
Chapter 5, the attempt on the life of the Shah and its consequences. The faith that had stirred a whole nation to its depth, for whose sake thousands of precious and heroic souls had been immolated, and on whose altar he who had been its author had sacrificed his life, was now being subjected to the strain and stress of yet another crisis of extreme violence and far-reaching consequences. It was one of those periodic crises which, occurring throughout a whole century, succeeded in momentarily eclipsing the splendor of the faith and in almost disrupting the structure of its organic institutions. Invariably sudden, often unexpected, seemingly fatal to both its spirit and its life, these inevitable manifestations of the mysterious evolution of a world religion, intensely alive, challenging in its claims, revolutionizing in its tenets, struggling against overwhelming odds, have either been externally precipitated by the malice of its avowed antagonists, or internally provoked by the unwisdom of its friends, the apostasy of its supporters, or the defection of some of its most highly placed amongst the kith and kin of its founders. No matter how disconcerting to the great mass of its loyal adherents, however much trumpeted by its adversaries as symptoms of its decline and impending dissolution, these admitted setbacks and reverses, from which it has time and again so tragically suffered, have, as we look back upon them, failed to arrest its march or impair its unity. Heavy indeed has been the toll which they exacted, unspeakable the agonies they engendered, widespread and paralyzing for a time the consternation they provoked. Yet, viewed in their proper perspective, each of them can be confidently pronounced a blessing in disguise, affording a providential means for the release of a fresh outpouring of celestial strength, a miraculous escape from the imminent and still more dreadful calamities, an instrument for the fulfillment of age-old prophecies, an agency for the purification and revitalization of the life of the community, an impetus for the enlargement of its limits and the propagation of its influence, and a compelling evidence of the indestructibility of its cohesive strength. Sometimes at the height of the crisis itself, more often when the crisis was past, the significance of these trials had manifested itself to men's eyes, and the necessity of such experiences has been demonstrated far and wide and beyond the shadow of doubt to both friend and foe. Seldom, if indeed at any time, has the mystery underlying these portentous, God-sent upheavals remained undisclosed, or the profound purpose of the meaning of their occurrence been left hidden from the minds of men. Such a severe ordeal, the faith of the Bab, still in the earliest stages of its infancy, was now beginning to experience. Maligned and hounded from the moment it was born, deprived in its earliest days of the sustaining strength of the majority of its leading supporters, stunned by the tragic and sudden removal of its founder, reeling under the cruel blows it had successively sustained in Mazandaran, Tehran, Nayriz, and Zanjan, a sorely persecuted faith was about to be subjected through the shameful act of a fanatical and irresponsible Babi to a humiliation such as it had never before known. To the trials it had undergone was now added the oppressive load of a fresh calamity, unprecedented in its gravity, disgraceful in its character, and devastating in its immediate consequences.
So again, we're talking about all the things the faith has undergone, the crisis, the victories, and how to view this and how to look through a certain lens to understand what's been happening. We know that the ordeal of the faith of the Bab was actually horrendous. The thousands of people, the Holocaust that's about to take place, actually, because of this act that we're just about to talk about. So there's many things that are going to be going on, and every faith in the beginning has its struggles, and then hopefully things grow. But the Bab is being revolutionizing in the way he's talking, and some people are very much with things, some people are not. But quite often, the things that bring down a prophet are the actions of its followers. And this is what we're concerned about here, and which Baha'u'llah talks about a lot, about the way in which his followers have behaved, have been the things that have upset him the most.
Obsessed by the bitter tragedy of the martyrdom of his beloved master, driven by a frenzy of despair to avenge that odious deed, and believing the author and instigator of that crime to be none other than the Shah himself, a certain Sadiq Tabrizi, an assistant in a confectioner's shop in Tehran, proceeded on an August day, August 15, 1852, together with his accomplice, an equally obscure youth named Fatullah Gomi, to Nira Varan, where the imperial army had encamped and the sovereign was in residence, and there, waiting by the roadside, in the guise of an innocent bystander, fired a round of shot from his pistol at the Shah. Shortly after, the latter had emerged on horseback from the palace grounds for his morning promenade. The weapon the assailant employed demonstrated beyond the shadow of a doubt the folly of that half-demented youth, and clearly indicated that no man of sound judgment could have possibly instigated so senseless an act. The whole of Nir Varan, where the imperial court and troops had congregated, was, as a result of this assault, plunged into an unimaginable turmoil. The ministers of the state, headed by Mirza Akka Khan Nuri, the Intermediate Dawla, the successor of the Emir Nizam, rushed horror-stricken to the side of their wounded sovereign. The fanfare of the trumpets, the rolling of the drums, and the shrill piping of the fifes summoned the hosts of His Imperial Majesty on all sides. The Shah's attendants, some on horseback, others on foot, poured into the palace grounds. Pandemonium reigned, in which everyone issued orders. None listened, none obeyed, nor understood anything. Ardashir Mirza, the governor of Tehran, having in the meantime already ordered his troops to patrol the deserted streets of the capital, barred the gates of the citadel as well as of the city, charged his batteries, and fervently dispatched a messenger to ascertain the veracity of the wild rumors that were circulating amongst the populace, and to ask for special instruction. No sooner had this act been perpetrated than its shadow fell across the entire body of the Babi community. A storm of public horror, disgust, and resentment, heightened by the implacable hostility of the mother of the youthful sovereign, swept the nation, casting aside all possibility of even the most elementary inquiry into the origins and instigators of the attempt. A sign, a whisper, was sufficient to implicate the innocent and loose upon him the most abominable afflictions. An army of foes, ecclesiastics, state officials, and people united in relentless hate and watching for an opportunity to discredit and annihilate a dreaded adversary, had, at long last, been afforded the pretext for which it was longing. Now it could achieve its malevolent purpose. Though the faith had, from its inception, disclaimed any intention of usurping the rights and prerogatives of the state, though its exponents and disciples had sedulously avoided any act that might arouse the slightest suspicion of a desire to wage a holy war, or even to evince an aggressive attitude, yet its enemies, deliberately ignoring the numerous evidences of the marked restraint exercised by the followers of a persecuted religion, proved themselves capable of inflicting atrocities as barbarous as those which will ever remain associated with the bloody episodes of Mazindaran, Nayriz, and Zanjan. To what depths of infamy and cruelty would not this same enemy be willing to descend now that an act so treasonable, so audacious had been committed? What accusations would it not be prompted to level at, and what treatment would it not meter out to those who, however unjustifiably, could be associated with so heinous a crime against one who, in his person, combined the chief magistracy of the realm of the trusteeship of the hidden Imam?
Wow, so craziness is absolutely taking place. The worst thing that could happen now is basically happening in a place called Niavaran. These two youths, one is Sadegh Tabrizi, who used to work in a confectionery shop, and the other was Fatalaya Gami. It's always those confectionery people you need to watch. These two youths, these two Babis, basically come up with this plan, and actually Baha'u'llah had caught wind, from what I understand, of this plan, and there was this guy named Azim who was remarkable, and people would meet in his house, and there were certain things that maybe took place in his house. It's argued that this took place in his house, but Azim wasn't down, he wasn't trying to push this. But this event takes place where they decide to assassinate the king. They say, look, because the Bab has been put to death, this is the retaliation we'll take. And Baha'u'llah absolutely quashed us down and said, this is ridiculous. Absolutely not. You're not following the words of the Bab. This must in no way, shape, or form take place. Sadegh Tabrizi and Fatalaya Gami, however, decide to do the opposite. So they're in Niavaran, and they're there and they're waiting for the king to come. And they are armed with a pellet gun. Stand there on the corner, and they're waiting for the king to come. As the king comes past, bang, 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 they start shooting. I think they hit the elbow, the funny bone of the king. They catch him there. The strings of the automated horse, I think one of those is damaged. The pellet gun does absolutely nothing, really, to the king. Then they run around the king who's on horse, and they start to try and pull him off the horse. Now, using their genius brains, one of them grabs one leg of the king and is trying to pull him down this way. The other one goes and grabs the other leg and trying to pull him the other way. The king is obviously like, what are you doing? There's a horse underneath me. Completely finding this ridiculous. But of course it's serious, because there's been an assassination attempt on the life of the king. Mirza Agha Khan Noori, the prime minister, he also had problems with Baha'u'llah. He didn't like Baha'u'llah because Haji Mirza Agassi in the days preceding had been very kind to Baha'u'llah, and he got very jealous, and he thought, why is Haji Mirza Agassi being so kind to Baha'u'llah? And he got very jealous and envious of Baha'u'llah. So he's now there. He then rushes in and he tries to secure things, and pandemonium ensues. And we know that this action is going to be taken and it's going to be used. What a great excuse, basically, for now torturing the Babis as they were doing left, right, and center. Now they have a real reason that they can say, look, this is what's needed. Now, from the text, it's clear and evident. It describes this Babi as a half-demented youth. This idea was ridiculous, was in no way, shape, or form in line with what the Bab was teaching. And it's so easy, again, for any follower of any faith to do anything and to implicate that faith through it. The mum of the Shah is not happy in any way, shape, or form. And she is furious, and she is going to get to the bottom of this.
The reign of terror which ensued was revolting beyond description. The spirit of revenge that animated those who had unleashed its horrors seemed insatiable. Its repercussions echoed as far as the press of Europe, branding with infamy its bloodthirsty participants. The Grand Vizier, wishing to reduce the chances of blood revenge, divided the work of executing those condemned to death among the princes and nobles. His principal fellow ministers, the generals and officers of the court, the representatives of the sacerdotal and merchant classes, the artillery and the infantry. Even the Shah himself had his allotted victim, though to save the dignity of the crown, he delegated the steward of his household to fire the fatal shot on his behalf. Ardashir Mirza, on his part, picketed the gates of the capital and ordered the guards to scrutinize the faces of all those who sought to leave it. Summoning to his presence the Kalantar, the Durgi, and the Kadhudas, he bade them search out and arrest everyone suspected of being a Babi. A youth named Abbas, a former servant of a well-known adherent of the faith, was on threat of inhuman torture, induced to walk the streets of Tehran and point out everyone he recognized as being a Babi. He was even coerced into denouncing any individual whom he thought would be willing and able to pay a heavy bribe to secure his freedom. The first to suffer on that calamitous day was the ill-fated Sadegh, who was instantly slain on the scene of his attempted crime. His body was tied to the tail of a mule and dragged all the way to Tehran, where it was hewn into two halves, each of which was suspended and exposed to the public view, while the Tehranis were invited by the city authorities to mount the ramparts and gaze upon the mutilated corpse. Molten lead was poured down the throat of his accomplice after having subjected him to the torture of red-hot pincers and limb-rendering screws. A comrade of his, Haji Qasim, was stripped of his clothes, lighted candles were thrust into holes made in his flesh, and was paraded before the multitude who shouted and cursed him. Others had their eyes gouged out, were sawn asunder, strangled, blown from the mouths of cannons, chopped into pieces, hewn apart with hatchets and maces, shod with horseshoes, bayoneted and stoned. Torture-mongers vied with each other in running the gamut of brutality, while the populace into whose hands the body of the hapless victims were delivered would close in upon their prey and would so mutilate them as to leave no trace of their original form. The executioners, though accustomed to their own gruesome task, would themselves be amazed at the fiendish cruelty of the populace. Women and children could be seen led down the streets by their executioners, their flesh in ribbons, with candles burning in their wounds, singing with ringing voices before the silent spectators, "Verily from God we come, and unto him we return." As some of the children expired on their way, their tormentors would fling their bodies under the feet of their fathers and sisters, who, proudly treading upon them, would not deign to give them a second glance. A father, according to the testimony of a distinguished French writer, rather than abjure his faith, preferred to have the throats of his 2 young sons, both already covered with blood, slit upon his breast, as he lay on the ground, whilst the elder of the 2, a lad of 14, vigorously pressing his right of seniority, demanded to be the first to lay down his life. An Austrian officer, Captain von Gumans, in the employ of the Shah at the time, was, it is reliably stated, so horrified at the cruelties he was compelled to witness that he tendered his resignation. "Follow me, my friend," is the captain's own testimony in a letter he wrote 2 weeks after the attempt in question, which was published in the Sultan Freund. "You who lay claim to a heart in European ethics, follow me to the unhappy ones who, with gouged out eyes, must eat on the scene of the deed, without any sauce, their own amputated ears, or whose teeth are torn out with inhuman violence by the hand of the executioner, whose bare skulls are simply crushed by blows from a hammer, or where the bazaar is illuminated with unhappy victims, because on right and left the people dig deep holes in their breasts and shoulders, and insert burning wicks in the wounds. I saw some dragged in chains through the bazaar, preceded by a military band, and in whom these wicks had burned so deep that now the fat flickered convulsively in the wound like a newly extinguished lamp. Not seldom it happens that the unwearying ingenuity of the Oriental leads to fresh tortures. They will skin the soles of the Barbie's feet, soak the wounds in boiling oil, shoe the foot like the hoof of a horse, and compel the victim to run. No cry escaped from the victim's breast. The torment is endured in dark silence by the numb sensation of the fanatic. Now he must run. The body cannot endure what the soul has endured. He falls. Give him the coup de grace. Put him out of his pain. No. The executioner swings the whip, and I myself have had to witness it. The unhappy victim of 100-fold tortures runs. This is the beginning of the end. As for the end itself, they hang the scorched and perforated bodies by their hands and feet to a tree head downwards, and now every Persian may try his marksmanship to his heart's content from a fixed but not too proximate distance, a noble quarry at his disposal. I saw corpses torn by nearly 150 bullets. When I read over again, he continues, what I have written, I am overcome by the thought that those who are with you in our dearly beloved Austria may doubt the full truth of the picture and accuse me of exaggeration. Would to God that I had not lived to see it, but by the duties of my profession I was unhappily often, only too often, a witness of these abominations. At present I never leave my house, in order not to meet with fresh scenes of horror. Since my whole soul revolts against such infamy, I will no longer maintain my connection with the scene of such crimes. Little wonder that a man as far famed as Renan should, in his Les Apôtres, have characterized the hideous butchery perpetrated in a single day during the Great Massacre of Tehran as a day perhaps unparalleled in the history of the world.
What a horrible and gruesome explanation of what's happened to these Babis. It's almost sickening to read, so I apologize for that. But
question, this was written to Austria, is that right? Did I read that
this
right?
was written by an Austrian, Captain von Gomons, in his book, The Soldatenfreund. He writes this back to his powers that be in Austria as he resigns. He says, I'm not doing this anymore. So yes, Abbas, who's the servant of this Babi, he is basically taken, and they say to him, right, we want you to point out all the Babis. So now they are going around Tehran and they're going to point out exactly who the Babis are, and this is where the Babis are going to be found out. What they also say to Abbas is they say, look, if you think there's anyone there who has enough money to actually pay their way out of this, just point him out as well. It doesn't matter, because obviously the corruption there is just on a whole other level. And I said, just point at anyone, but let's get some of these Babis. So they didn't really care who they were killing, and it shows the mentality that was around at the time. Now, the two people that tried to kill the king was Sadegh Tabrizi. This first one, we know that he is tied to a mule, and then from Niavaran, he's dragged all the way to Tehran. When he gets there, if he's alive, I very much doubt he'd be alive after being dragged that distance. His body is then cut in half, and then he's put up in Tehran for everybody to see, and people are invited to come and see him. His other accomplice, Fatullah Rami, he has molten lead that's poured down his throat. Molten lead that's poured down his throat. We also know that Haji Qassem, another one of them who was involved in this, is tortured. We then hear of some of the tortures that take place, that horseshoes are put into their feet. Their eyes are gouged out. They're sometimes cut in two. They're lucky. They're strangled. They are tied to cannons with their backs against the cannon with cannonballs that are blown through them. Candles are then cut into the body and they're stuck inside their body in the wounds. And some of these Babis that have nothing to do with this, they are thinking, verily we come from God, verily we're going back to God, as they're moving on. They are being martyred. Now these people are the innocent, that it's nothing to do with them, but these are the tortures that are being inflicted upon the Babis. Then we have the report from Captain von Gomons, who in the Soldatenfreund gives some details, and he resigns. He says, I cannot deal with this anymore. And he talks about people, the Babis, having their ears chopped off, and they're forced to eat them. And he adds, without any sauce, that they're forced to eat their own ears, if you could just imagine that for a second. That their teeth are being torn out. That again, they have these burning wicks. So this is not by someone who claims that, who goes on to be a Babi or a Baha'i at all. This is from an independent source, and this is why the Guardians put this in. And it's written back to the Austrians. And they have burning wicks that are put inside them. That the wounds that are basically caused and cut, they're then dipped in burning oil. That they skin the soles of the feet. They put hooves on them and they make them run. Such is the disgusting tortures that are taking place here, only cause that inflicts the maximum pain, and designedly to make people aware that if you're going to be a Babi, if you're going to be a follower of Sayyid Ali Muhammad, this is the price you will pay. These are the tortures that are going to be inflicted upon you. Absolutely disgusting. This whole Holocaust of the Babis basically starts to begin now. Absolutely terrifying, sickening stuff that's taking place.
The hand that was stretched to deal so grievous a blow to the adherents of a sorely tried faith did not confine itself to the rank and file of the Bab's persecuted followers. It was raised with equal fury and determination against and struck down with equal force the few remaining leaders who had survived the winnowing winds of adversity that had already laid low so vast a number of the supporters of the faith. Tahira, that immortal heroine, who had already shed imperishable lustre alike on her sex and on the cause she had espoused, was swept into and ultimately engulfed by the raging storm. Sayyid Hussein, the amanuensis of the Bab, the companion of his exile, the trusted repository of his last wishes, and the witness of the prodigies attended upon his martyrdom, fell likewise a victim of its fury. That hand had even the temerity to lift itself against the towering figure of Baha'u'llah. But though it laid hold of him, it failed to strike him down. It imperiled his life. It imprinted on his body indelible marks of a pitiless cruelty, but it was impotent to cut short a career that was destined not only to keep alive the fire which the spirit of the Bab had kindled, but to produce a conflagration that would at once consummate and outshine the glories of his revelation. During those somber and agonizing days, when the Bab was no more, when the luminaries that had shone in the firmament of his faith had been successively extinguished, when his nominee, a bewildered fugitive in the guise of a dervish, with kashkul, alms basket, in his hand, roamed the mountains and plains in the neighborhood of Rasht, Baha'u'llah, by reason of the acts he had performed, appeared in the eyes of a vigilant enemy as its most redoubtable adversary and as the sole hope of an as yet unextirpated heresy. His seizure and death had now become imperative. He it was who, scarce 3 months after the faith was born, received through the envoy of the Bab, Mullah Hussein, the scroll which bore to him the first tidings of a newly announced revelation, who instantly acclaimed its truth and arose to champion its cause. It was to his native city and dwelling place that the steps of that envoy were first directed, as the place which enshrined a mystery of such transcendent holiness as neither Hijaz nor Shiraz can hope to rival. It was Mullah Hussein's report of the contact thus established, which had been received with such exultant joy by the Bab, and had brought such reassurance to his heart as to finally decide him to undertake his contemplated pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. Baha'u'llah alone was the object and the center of the cryptic allusions, the glowing eulogies, the fervid prayers, the joyful announcements, and the dire warnings recorded in both the Gayamul Azma and the Bayan, designed to be respectively the first and last written testimonials to the glory with which God was soon to invest him. It was he who, through his correspondence with the author of the newly founded faith and his intimate association with the most distinguished among its disciples, such as Wahid, Hujat, Qudus, Mullah Hussein, and Tahireh, was able to foster its growth, elucidate its principles, reinforce its ethical foundations, fulfill its urgent requirements, avert some of the immediate dangers threatening it, and participate effectually in its rise and consolidation. It was to him, the one object of our adoration and love, that the Prophet pilgrim on his return to Bushehr alluded when dismissing Qudus from his presence. He announced to him the double joy of attaining the presence of their beloved and of quaffing the cup of martyrdom. He it was who, in the heyday of his life, flinging aside every consideration of earthly fame, wealth, and position, careless of danger and risking the obloquy of his caste, arose to identify himself, first in Tehran and later in his native province of Mazandaran, with the cause of an obscure and proscribed sect, won to its support a large number of the officials and notables of Nur, not excluding his own associates and relatives, fearlessly and persuasively expounded its truths to the disciples of the illustrious Mujtahid, Mullah Muhammad, enlisted under its banner the Mujtahid's appointed representatives, secured, in consequence of this act, the unreserved loyalty of a considerable number of ecclesiastical dignitaries, government officers, peasants, and traders, and succeeded in challenging, in the course of a memorable interview, the Mujtahid himself. It was solely due to the potency of the written message entrusted by him to Mullah Muhammad Mehdiyer Kandi and delivered to the Bab while in the neighborhood of the village of Kulain, that the soul of the disappointed captive was able to rid itself, at an hour of uncertainty and suspense, of the anguish that had settled upon it ever since his arrest in Shiraz. He it was who, for the sake of Tahirih and her imprisoned companions, willingly submitted himself to a humiliating confinement, lasting several days. The first he was made to suffer in the house of one of the Qad Khudas of Tehran. It was to his caution, foresight, and ability that must be ascribed her successful escape from Qazvin, her deliverance from her opponents, her safe arrival in his home, and her subsequent removal to a place of safety in the vicinity of the capital, from whence she proceeded to Khorasan. It was into his presence that Mullah Hussein was secretly ushered upon his arrival in Tehran, after which interview he traveled to Azerbaijan on his visit to the Bab, then confined in the fortress of Marku. He it was who unobtrusively and unerringly directed the proceedings of the conference of Badasht, who entertained as his guests Qudus, Tahirih, and the 81 disciples who had gathered on that occasion, who revealed every day a tablet and bestowed on each of the participants a new name, who faced unaided the assault of a mob of more than 500 villagers in Niyala, who shielded Qudus from the fury of his assailants, who succeeded in restoring a part of the property which the enemy had plundered, and who ensured the protection and safety of the continually harassed and much abused Tahirih. Against him was kindled the anger of Muhammad Shah, who, as a result of the persistent representations of mischief makers, was at last induced to order his arrest and summon him to the capital, a summons that was destined to remain unfulfilled as a result of the sudden death of the sovereign. It was to his counsels and exhortations addressed to the occupants of Sheikh Tabarsi, who had welcomed him with such reverence and love during his visit to that fort, that must be attributed in no small measure the spirit evinced by its heroic defenders.
We're going to rest it there. Thank you, just because I'm very conscious of the time, but beautifully read. What we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen, we're just going to have a little recap of this particular section. Now, this section mentions Tahirih, who's, because of this assassination attempt on the king, Tahirih has now issues. There are problems. We know that Sayyid Hussein, one of the amanuensis, one of the secretaries of His Holiness the Bab, is put to death. They are now coming after Baha'u'llah, and we know that Baha'u'llah doesn't get put to death, but there's many things that he's going to suffer, like being put in the Siyachal in the Black Pit. The Guardian then goes on to basically talk about Baha'u'llah here. And he gives a recap about Baha'u'llah, and he says that it was him that had met Mullah Hussein when Mullah Hussein went up to Tehran and spoke to Mullah Mu'allim and gave the scroll to Baha'u'llah. So it was Baha'u'llah that, through Mullah Mu'allim and through Mullah Hussein, had discovered the Bab. It talks about Baha'u'llah setting alight Mazandaran, the province above Tehran, just here, that it was actually Baha'u'llah that caused this to be. And we know this was actually the foremost place in Iran for that accepted the Babi and the Baha'i revelation. We know that upon receiving the letter of Mullah Hussein that was sent from Mashhad via Yazd by the maternal uncle of the Bab, Haji Mirza Sayyid Ali, that when they received this, that the Bab was so ecstatic and Qudus was so ecstatic that they talked about this thing about what happens between the months of Jamadi and Rajab. So between the months of Jamadi and Rajab, there's maybe like 3 or 4 months between them. This is the time period where we know this guy Mirza Ahmad tries to find out what happened. What was this event that takes place? When he meets Mullah Hussein later on, Mullah Hussein says, what do you mean? Oh, Jamadi and Rajab, that event. And he doesn't explain to him. But we know that this is when Baha'u'llah had received this message, the scroll that was given by Mullah Hussein to Mullah Mu'alim to give to Baha'u'llah. So this is where Baha'u'llah accepts the faith. And so it talks about the excitement that the Bab had through this. We know that Baha'u'llah had managed to teach many of the disciples of Mullah Muhammad in Mazandaran. We know that many traders, many ecclesiastic people, many government officials had fallen in love with His Holiness Baha'u'llah. We know that Tahirih, after the assassination attempt on her father-in-law, that Baha'u'llah really steps in and really tries to help things out in Qazvin, and eventually comes up with this plan where Tahirih is freed, and she, in the guise of a beggar, it says, she goes, and then she goes to Tehran. We know that Baha'u'llah is also responsible for orchestrating the events of Badasht, this incredible event where you've got Qudus Tahirih, 81 souls that are there in the conference of Badasht. And this is where Baha'u'llah bestows upon them these new names, where Tahirih gets her name, Tahirih Qudus, Muhammad Ali, which is his actual name, he gets the name Qudus. So all these incredible things that start taking place. We know that after this, the conference of Badasht that took place up here, we know that they go to a place called Nayallah. And while they're in Nayallah, again, some of the followers of the Bab, after seeing that Tahirih has taken a veil off, think that, oh, great, well, chastity is no longer a thing, and they cause an upset in Nayallah, and then Baha'u'llah, again, masterfully gets everyone to safety, looks after Tahirih. We know that Muhammad Shah, the king at the time, had delivered this statement that it would cause the death of Baha'u'llah, and Baha'u'llah was going to be killed. That's what the thing was happening. But then we know that a few days later, Muhammad Shah is dead. So Baha'u'llah gets away with that. So there's so many things. Muhammad Shah wanted him to die. The mother of Muhammad Shah wanted to die. And this is just going through some of the things, basically, some of the attacks that now diversions have turned to Baha'u'llah. They know that he is actually, in a sense, the head, even though the leadership of the Babi community was meant to be carried on by Baha'u'llah's brother. This is what the Bab had written, that the leadership, unless a bunch of things happen, him whom God shall make manifest comes, and the rest of it. So, and I suspect this was to divert the attention away as much as possible from Baha'u'llah. But this assassination attempt has taken place, horrible atrocities has happened, and Baha'u'llah is now also being pursued. So this here really just goes into the different things that Baha'u'llah had dealt with, and that's why I paused Dick Hackers, who was reading, and I asked her to pause there because it just does go on for a while. Are there any comments or questions on this, ladies and gentlemen?
Dave, a quick comment here. I find this passage really, really, really interesting, and I'm very grateful to the Guardian that he essentially summarized all that Baha'u'llah had done prior to being thrown into the Sea of Charn, and so prior to having the revelation, right? And because we knew all this information, it was scattered, throughout the various episodes. And I think it's very interesting to review that and really try to memorize it and really have the various, all that Baha'u'llah had done before his revelation in mind. Because I've read in some non-Baha'i books, when they talk about the Baha'i revelation, they often portray that there was a kind of conflict between Mirza Yahya and Baha'u'llah, and for the, how do you say it, for thank you, yeah, for the leadership of the Baha'i community, and when Baha'u'llah won, essentially. And the whole time, as Tyrone John, I think, was reading, I was thinking, like, you don't need, like, how, like, it's so clear in history, like, these are facts, And it's very interesting that the passage starts by the Guardian mentioning Mirza Yahya in, like, one word, right? He says, when his nominee, a bewildered fugitive in the guise of a dervish, with a kashkun in hand, roamed the mountains and plains in the neighborhood of Rasht. And it's out of, he just says that. I mean, it's like, it's crazy when you read the history, and just these are just facts. You don't even have to be a believer. And you're like, why are these like scholars and academics portraying the whole thing as just a conflict between the two, and and just one wins? But anyway, so I just wanted to point that out. It's interesting to like really know all of that, and because the one I had in mind a lot was like, Baha'u'llah when he was in Badash. I wouldn't like this interview with Mullah Muhammad. All these other events are important to keep in mind as well.
Thank you very much, Della. Roxana, sorry. These very good points that you make, and this is, you can see by contrast actually, as you've so well mentioned, when Mirza Yahya, who was kind of this leader of the Babi community, as it were, when things happen, when this whole assassination attempts, what does Mirza Yahya do? He runs into the mountains and he pretends to be a dervish. He's even got this begging basket that he has with them, because the dervishes, from what I understand, they want to spend all their time just praising God, so they don't want to work, and people give them money, so they've got these bowls. This is what Mirza Yahya does. He just runs. Baha'u'llah goes to the forefront, steps in to help Taharat Qudus and run the whole thing. Very, very different things. So yes, there are many accounts written by non-Baha'i sources, and it would certainly be true that we don't necessarily give as much weight to their accounts. And there are things that are clear and evident there. Thank you very much for that point. Are there any other comments or questions before we come to a close? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as I was saying, it is we've come to the end of our session. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining us. Again, this story continues, it goes deeper, and please do visit Some Answered Questions and look into these things on prophecy. If you're excited by prophecy, some people aren't, some people are more excited by the stories. There's something for everyone. It's just so exciting, it's so deep, and it's very difficult to adequately portray what's going on. So I hope I've been able to do that to some degree anyway. But ladies and gentlemen, we're going to end with our devotional. So if there's anyone out there who would like to share a prayer with us, we would very much appreciate it. Thank you very much. Alapa, and good night. O God, my beloved, my heart's desire.